Hey, friends, welcome to the Small Circle Big Impact podcast. I am Amanda Winchester.
And I'm Christy Nichols. We are friends and Christian communicators on a mission to be a light in this world and serve others through our faith.
We want to invite you to join us in our small circle chats as we candidly talk about real life topics that have a big impact on our daily lives.
Thank you for joining us as we kick off our episode 3 podcast topic on overcoming. During this 4-part series, we will be doing a deep dive into parts of our personal testimonies and experiences with overcoming relationship struggles. Today, we are going to start by sharing some experiences in our mother-daughter relationships and the ways that God has helped us overcome the struggles we faced in those relationships.
Hey, friends, it's Amanda, and just as Christy introduced, we are going to be going over this topic of overcoming. This is something we have really both looked forward to. It's something that we both have a lot of passion behind. I want to start off by just saying that the word overcome, as defined by Webster, had a very simplistic definition, which was to get the better of, to surmount, to conquer, to subdue, as to overcome enemies in battle. Where most of that is true and pretty powerful, I found that Webster was really lacking the personal understanding of what it takes to overcome.
Yeah.
When I think of the word overcome, I immediately think of the need for action, but also the need for silence. I think of the need to put one foot in front of the other, but the need to rest from the weight. I'm actually truly overwhelmed with mixed emotions all the way from childhood to this very moment in time on what I have overcome and still overcoming. Overcoming is not something you have to do once and you've understood what it takes to overcome. It's a compilation of trauma and events that have led you to different moments and seasons and the need to stop, heal, do the work, and move forward to healing. Overcoming is the word used to describe an individual still figuring it out.
Yeah.
Overcame is the word used to describe your trials you have endured, worked through, and healed from, and now you can tuck it away and share how you made it out. An overcomer is the word used when you conquer your demons and they no longer hinder you or your walk. And as I share this, I realize there are still many things I'm overcoming. And funny thing is before this podcast, Christy and I spent a good hour or more talking about things that we still needed to overcome.
Yeah.
Overcoming is messy and hard. It's unwarranted feelings and brokenness and healing traumatic areas of your life caused by yourself or maybe someone else. It's learning to breathe and trust again. It's a lifetime of little moments that you carry and endure. And it's a million little moments where you understand how strong you are as a person and in Christ.
Wow. So, yeah, just like Amanda said, we just had this hour-long conversation about something else that ended up fitting right into this segment and what we're talking about today. And I think we both just realized that.
Yeah.
And I want to say that just listening to you, I can hear your healing journey play out before you even get started. And I hear the process of healing and overcoming unfolding in what you just said. And I agree, for many of us, life is a collection of events and relationships that we've had to learn how to overcome or that we're continuing to learn to overcome. When reflecting on our family relationships, I think one of the best places to start is to recognize that there's no perfect person and there is no perfect family.
Yeah.
It just is what it is. That's the reality. Overcoming family relationship struggles is going to look different from person to person. And again, we were just talking about some things earlier that might be strategies or help support each other in the areas that we were just talking about. But it might mean counseling, just choosing forgiveness. It might mean learning how to set boundaries or just walking away completely. But whatever path we choose to take for us to come out as healthy as possible on the other side of things, I think it has to be an intentional, lifelong process that involves our faith and a total reliance on God. And I just described it this way earlier. I said, I think that what we were talking about earlier, it's a circle.
Yeah.
It's a process. It's not a linear line. For me personally, healing began with understanding that the trauma and the baggage we carry around with us has the potential to hurt other people.
Yeah.
And when I think about struggles I faced in my relationship with my mother specifically, I immediately think all the way back to the trauma that she experienced as a child.
Yeah.
Her story informs my story, but it stops there. It informs, but it doesn't define my story.
Absolutely.
And because I believe He could, I know that God changed the trajectory of my story. And I can undoubtedly identify the pivotal moment, which I'll say for another day, when I knew that I had to allow the hand of God to protect me from continuing a cycle of generational curses. And I honestly believe that it took me that moment, as well as a decision to overcome my relationship struggles I had with my mother, to change the course of my own life.
Absolutely. And I love the part where you mention about generational curses, or even can be called generational cycles, because unfortunately we are children, and we do witness and see certain things growing up, and we assume that that's how we should act or behave or live our life. And it's powerful to hear you say that it informs your story, but it doesn't define your story. That's good. I didn't learn about overcoming as an adult, which I'm sure many of us haven't. My education on overcoming came from very early in life. I was born to a single mother who unfortunately dealt with a lot of unhealed hurt and pain, feelings of shame and guilt, which in turn led to alcohol abuse. It's not hard for me now to talk about her and the struggles we faced. And I say we because I faced those with her. However, it used to hurt me. It used to make me sad, and it used to make me wonder what I could do to go heal that version of my mom. My mother is still alive and she's doing great. And at the end of this, you will hear more about her redemption. My mom was the last of four children, and at just a newborn, she had pneumonia. The year my mom was born, medicine was not as advanced as it is now. So she sadly spent the first 11 months of her new little life in a hospital. She was her daddy's world, but not so much her mom. And that's where my mother's need for overcoming began. As just a small infant entering the world, and the tension that would arise in the relationship between her and her mother. Fast forward to 27 years of her life, and she would announce she was expecting with me, baby number one. As somewhat newly married spouse and alone most of the time in Virginia, where she moved to be with my dad, she was hundreds of miles from home with a man who was not good to her. Again, another pivotal moment where my mother had to endure overcoming and obstacles of her own. I'm not certain how many times my mother had to endure the need to overcome in the first 27 years of her life, but I know where I began to witness her ability to overcome obstacles that were thrown her way. She taught me strength and endurance and to handle any problem head on. And that's some of what Christy and I talked about this morning, that even though I seen the strength in her, sometimes certain things that we take from what we've seen can be good or could be a hindrance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of described a general theme as you were talking about your mother, and it makes me think about my mother. And I think the theme of my own mother's life started with her name.
Mm.
If I sound like I'm talking about her in the past tense, I am. She did die in 2011, but her name was Deborah, which means bee in Hebrew.
Oh, I did not know that. So
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, I didn't know that either until my sisters and I were all going through her things, and we found a little name, like a document that had her name on it, and it described the definition of her name.
Wow.
And I had always liked bees. I collected bees, I still do. But it was just interesting that we found that. And so bees are kind of special to us now.
Yeah.
But the bee also symbolizes being an overcomer.
Wow.
So if you look up bumblebee or bee, you'll see that it symbolizes that. And scientifically, it does not make sense that the bee can fly because of the weight of its body compared to the size of its wings.
Wow.
So aerodynamically, the bee is not supposed to be able to fly, but it doesn't know that and it flies anyway.
Wow.
So it's just a little sweet reminder. And it's a sweet way of remembering her too and honoring her and who she was. She was a tiny little person, but she was a big overcomer. I'm not familiar with early childhood stories from my mother's life, but I do know that my mother's mother, my nanny, as we called her, was married 3 times. Her first husband, so my biological grandpa, was a wonderful man. I'm not sure of the story behind why they divorced. And as was my mother's second stepfather, who I knew and I called Papa. So I had a grandpa and a papa
Oh.
that I knew and loved. However, my mother's first stepfather was not a good person. He was a fugitive, and at some point, this meant multiple moves across several states when my mother was somewhere between the ages of 11 and 13 years old.
Wow.
So my mother, her sister, her stepfather, and my nanny were caught up in this situation. And during that time, she experienced extreme poverty. I've heard stories of extreme poverty, having to move around so much, sexual abuse from her stepfather.
Mm.
She was in a traumatic accident where she was ran over by a drunk driver while she was fishing off the side of a bridge in rural Mississippi.
Goodness.
Yeah. So she spent almost a year of her life in a body cast and in a rehabilitation hospital. She was eventually moved back to Greenville, South Carolina, and did some rehab at Shriners Hospital. And it's actually where she fell in love with horse therapy and equine therapy. Several years of stress and trauma during a time of major physiological and biological changes for a young girl. It really impacted her growth and development. And it really impacted her entire life after that.
Yeah.
If you know anything about the term adverse childhood experiences, then you know and you might recognize that she could have been the poster child for studies and research on the lifelong impacts of childhood trauma. It really does affect your health outcomes, your mental health, all of those things. And after her recovery and my nanny managing to escape the abusive relationship that she had been in with her second husband, my mother got pregnant at 15. She dropped out of high school, she got married, and she had me when she was 16 years old. Her and my biological father didn't stay together too long after that. And so we soon lived with my nanny and her third husband, my sweet papa.
Mm.
But as you might expect, life isn't necessarily easy for a young teen mother who has continued to carry hurt from her past with her.
Yeah.
This reminded me of something that I read in a book by Lisa Turkhurst, Forgiving What You Can't Forget. And I know that's one of Amanda's favorite books too.
Yeah, so good.
I think that we actually read that together and did a Bible
Yes.
study together. Yeah. So Lisa talks about connecting dots from the past during a journey towards forgiveness and moving forward. And she reflects on talking with her friends about forgiveness, bitterness, and relationship struggles that are all tied to our growing up years. And in chapter 5 specifically, she says, I started to recognize how much we write scripts to help us navigate life experiences based on our past experiences, and how much those scripts turn into belief systems that inform our actions.
Wow, so good.
Lisa talks about her relationship with her mother, and she goes into explaining that to understand the way she, Lisa, functions herself, we as the readers have to understand who her mother was.
Wow.
And it's so true. I can relate to that so much. And looking back, I can absolutely now identify and remember the scripts and the habits that my mother created for herself as a means to survival.
Yeah.
Even when she found herself on the other side of some of the darkest times in her life, she brought the effects of her trauma into her relationship with me, as well as other relationships throughout her life.
Absolutely. And I think that, number one, I will never look at bees the same again. I actually never knew that. That is very awesome.
I
That
never shared that with you.
No, I never knew her name meant bee in Hebrew. That's like,
Yeah.
it makes me love bees with you even more. We have shared lots of stories about our childhood and growing up, and lots of stories about our mamas. And Christy has had the opportunity to meet my mama. And sadly, I don't have that same opportunity, but surely hearing that small little snippet, and I know that your mama has so much more that you could share about.
Yeah.
It really makes me feel connected to her, and to really understand that she did have a lot of impact on her life that maybe not was the greatest growing
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
And goodness, I couldn't imagine spending a whole year in a hospital in a full body cast. I mean,
No, especially at that age.
absolutely. I mean, very young and just trying to really figure life out. And man, that was good. I appreciate you sharing that aspect of your mama.
Mm.
I shared before, born to a single mother. And of course, my mom was actually married for about 8 years before she conceived me. So, whereas I say I was born to a single mother, she was actually pretty freshly getting a divorce when I was born, when she found out she was pregnant with me. I was born in December, so it was really a cold month to begin with. We all kind of know, especially if you're in the northerner states, it's a little colder. And my mom was in Virginia at the time. Um, she would soon be traveling back home though to Pensacola, Florida, to um, live with my grandparents. Like I shared, she was 6 months pregnant, maybe 7 months. She was a divorce up her sleeve, and humbly moving back in with her parents. I've lived on my own since I was about 21, so I'm 36. I couldn't imagine moving back home. As much as I love my mama, when you develop that sense of freedom, it's
Yeah.
difficult. So when I think about that, I think about one, how she probably felt mentally and emotionally as well.
Yeah.
And it's another moment where I have to imagine that my mom had to endure another need to overcome.
Yeah.
After just 2 short years of living with my grandparents, though, we did step into our first home together. And you will hear me talk um, a lot about things, and I will use the terms we and together, because we did. It was just the two of us. And Christy and I have talked about this numerous times, that we were wondering what podcast might endure us tearing up, and I think this might be the start of it. So if you hear us getting a little choked up, these are happy tears, but tears of remembrance, of knowing
Yeah.
what we've watched our family overcome.
Absolutely.
As I would grow older with more understanding, I would begin to see that my mother faced many, many nights alone, but with a natural light in her hand, just to numb the loneliness and the pain. She had an addiction to alcohol. I would recall countless nights of listening to her cry herself to sleep. She wouldn't have a clue how the next day was going to go, or if we would even make it. However, every single morning, without fail, I was woken up to hugs and kisses, and we were out the door. She held down a full-time job with no help from the government, where she raised me on an hourly wage of probably about $6 an hour. It's where I learned about overcoming. Fast forward a few years, I would soon be approaching the end of my elementary school years, and she would welcome, very unexpectedly, a new baby girl, also with a man who was not much of any good for her. She was broken, but she knew that if the Lord made a way before, he was going to do it again. She would again single-handedly raise me and my sister alone. My mother was born and raised in church. However, adult life came and went, and she found herself living outside the will of God. And if I had to speculate, it was the guilt and the shame that held her back.
Yeah.
She believed in the Lord, and I would hear her cry out to Him numerous times at night. At 9 years old, feeling helpless. I, on the other hand, was born and raised in church. I would attend with my grandparents every Sunday and at any event that was had. I was taught at an early age how prayer can truly change things as I witnessed my grandpa bedside praying and reading his word daily. And now that I am an adult, I am not lost on the thought that my prayers circled the throne of heaven and He heard them and He made a way for us. I would pray that she would stop drinking. I would beg Him to allow her to stop smoking. And months and days would pass where she was still smoking and still drinking. But I held out for hope. I learned about overcoming. All through my childhood, I had to endure a father that I would occasionally see, divine protection nonetheless. He was in and out every few years, and it was just nonchalant when he would come around. Thank goodness for my grandfather, who quickly stepped into the role of my dad, and my uncles surrounded me with love.
So, yeah, definitely listening to this part of your testimony is emotional. And I'm sorry, this is the early childhood, like, passionate research person in me, but
Yeah.
I can't help but go back to what I was saying about adverse childhood experiences and what we know about that. And one of the things that we know is that the more protective factors we have in our lives as little kids when we're enduring those things, the better chance that we do have a healthier later life outcomes. And the fact that you had family who had faith,
Yeah.
and you went to church with them. And y'all, I'm just going to say this, church isn't always a positive experience for people, and I
Right.
get that. But obviously it was for you, and it was a positive experience for you. And the Lord added that layer of protection in your life. That was your believing grandparents and the prayer that you witnessed and your grandfather being in the Word. That was protection for you. That was divine
Yes.
protection.
Absolutely.
And I can relate to the divine protection that you mentioned as it relates to your birth father, which
Yeah.
is also interesting for both of us. And we have more on that for a different time, but our stories are so similar in that way. And I can't imagine what life would be like if my birth father had not left us.
Absolutely.
But my mother met the man that I do know as my dad when I was somewhere between the age of 18 months and 2 years old, and they got married when I was 5. I didn't know that he wasn't my birth dad until I was 10 years old. So, again, another story for a different day. But I have great early childhood and elementary age memories with my family, and quality time seemed to have been important to them as a family. I spent a lot of time outside. We went horseback riding, camping, traveling to other states to visit my dad's family. I really developed this love of traveling when I was little because he had family that lived all over. So I got to go visit.
That's
And
fun.
so, yeah, definitely. I think that was a protective factor for me, but really just a time of experiencing life to the fullest.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, as I prepared for this segment of our podcast, I realized something that I hadn't really thought about before, I don't think. And if I have, I just don't remember. But I don't remember us going to church together. I don't remember my mom and my dad before their separation and divorce. I don't remember us going to church together.
Yeah.
I went to church with the neighbors, and I went to church with my dad's parents when we visited Florida. But in the early years, I do recall behavior from my mom that seemed odd to me as a small child. And as I got older, it seemed a little bit, I just was more observant, and I thought things were odd. But it would
Yeah.
be adolescence where things would really compound for my mother. One of my early memories that comes to mind is that she was heavily focused on stockpiling and storing food.
Wow.
We had a garden and it was beautiful, and I remember helping with the garden, and she would can and freeze vegetables and make pickles and soup and put it away for the winter.
Yum.
Yeah. She was known for her pickles for sure.
Mm.
We had a freezer food membership service and stocked up on meat. And I remember wondering why my mother bought so much food at the grocery store when we didn't need it. It would be packed into the cabinets so much that it seemed like it was falling out.
Wow.
I remember hearing my dad say something about her buying food that we did not need when she would get paid. And sometimes she would get upset about me getting a snack after school, and I would wonder, why did you buy this food if I can't eat it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I even remember finding food inside her nightstand, her bedside table, food that she did not eat, but she hid it there. So now I understand that this could have been a trauma response, and it's often seen in children and adults who've experienced extreme poverty,
Mm.
abuse, or neglect. And later on, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder somewhere in her late 20s, with many of the symptoms of that diagnosis having a significant impact on her lives.
Absolutely.
My parents separated when I was 12, and this is when I remember my relationship with my mother changing and declining. As much as she left me unattended with my younger sisters, she also somehow seemed to become equally as controlling and protective over me, which sounds counterintuitive. And at this point, she was on disability and unable to work. She was raising me and my two sisters on her own. We started out living with my great grandmother while she was sick. We took care of her. We all slept in one bed in one room, me and my sisters, and her in the other room with my grandmother. We then lived with my nanny after my great grandmother died, again, all sharing one room and two beds.
Mm.
But eventually, she settled us into our mobile home that we had moved out of initially, but got in the divorce, and she bought 3 acres with the divorce settlement. We didn't have a lot, but my mother was an overcomer,
Yeah.
and she was that determined little bee,
Mm.
and she took care of us. And she started taking us to church during those years. So, even so, as I got older, I remember her saying things like, "You will not make the same mistakes that I did." And she meant that. She meant she was going to control everything that she could about my little life so that I didn't fall victim to what she had experienced.
Wow.
And she was highly reactive. Some might consider her yelling and her methods of punishment as extreme. And, you know, I thought about sharing some specific things here, but I don't feel led to, because I don't want to leave that picture of her in the minds
Yeah.
of people. I just, it was extreme.
Yeah.
She was strict about chores and very particular about how the laundry was folded and how tidy my room was. I just had to be very careful
Yeah.
as a child not to get her upset. And I learned to make every effort at school and in my extracurricular activities to earn her words of affirmation and praise. If
Mm.
I was studying, if I was earning good grades, and I was participating in clubs, I was at cheerleading practice and volunteering on student council, there wasn't much time outside of that to get scolded or to disappoint her. So, whenever she would start dating a new man, I was in charge of my sisters, who I'm 7 and 9 years older than. But when the relationships would end, I would be there to console and comfort her. So, as a teenager, I felt responsible for being the second mother in our household. And I also felt responsible to be her counselor and her comforter.
Wow.
It wasn't until I went to college that I started realizing just how unhealthy my relationship with my mother really was. And our family dysfunction had been my normal up to that point. I know a lot of people are out there thinking, I can so relate to that. And we all have our own set of dysfunction.
Yeah.
But this, I feel like, significantly impacted the way that I would navigate my first marriage and early adulthood friendships, even. I had become a people pleaser who avoided conflict, and I would do anything for approval, even if it meant compromising who I was. I said I was sorry when it wasn't necessary. I struggled with boundaries. I prioritized other people's happiness above my own frequently. It was like I had become a magnet for manipulation and dysfunctional relationships, and I really just let people walk all over me.
Yeah.
I was in my 20s and I continued to struggle with my relationship with my mother, even though I wasn't under the same roof with her anymore. I was a Christian and I loved Jesus, but I had no idea who I was in Christ.
Wow, that is powerful. And I feel like you and I both kind of share so many similarities in our childhood, and the fact that we still went to church, but it wasn't with our mamas or
Yeah,
our family per se. Um, my mom also very much had extreme tendencies of punishment. And, it would be things like yelling and saying certain words that probably were not the most appropriate. Um, you know, uh, just the typical kind of punishments, but to a more extreme
yeah,
level. And I was sitting here as you were talking about that, and my mom didn't repeatedly say it, but would say it often enough I could remember. She wanted me to be different. She didn't want me to go through the same struggles that she had to face. And it's very funny that both of our mothers would say those same things, because um, I think they obviously loved us and they wanted
mhm,
us to have better. But in order to get that out of their system, it wasn't a loving way of showing that. It was a almost, I'm going to hopefully force you into realizing I want you to be different. I want you to be better than who I was. Um, and when I really think about, who my mom was, um, I wouldn't say that she was a bad person, as if I'm hearing the same about your mom. They
yeah,
weren't bad ladies, but it almost feels like they had so much hurt and so much pain, and no one there to really validate their goodness,
yeah,
because they were good people. But the shame and the guilt and the trauma and the things that had happened really subdued their abilities to see their goodness.
yeah,
And so they just really wanted us to understand and know. They wanted us to be different. I became pregnant at 22, and that is a story that could be for another podcast as well. Um, I became pregnant with my first and only son. Many complications after him would lead to an inability for me to ever bear children again. But during my pregnancy, I had a conversation with my mom one day. And I spoke to her and I said, these were, I would like to say my exact words. I told her I had to endure the drunken nights, the sleepless nights, wondering if you would even wake up the next day, the 2 a.m. checks to sit your spilled beer down and put your cigarette out and usher you to bed. I literally had to, at 9, 10, 11 years old, wake my mother up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go put her in her own bed. The crying, the lashing out, and so on. I was young and I didn't have a choice, but I am now on the verge of being a mother. I'm grown with my own house, and I have a choice of who my son is exposed to. And I told her, if you cannot stop the drinking, you will not be a part of his life.
wow,
And that was hard for me to say, but I left her house that day fully aware of what I had said, fully aware that I meant every single word, and a possibility of knowing. that it fell on deaf ears. But I knew that my job was to protect my son from exposure
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't have that protection.
Yeah.
I trusted the Lord. And several months had passed, and one day we're sitting at our house, and I would visit my mama frequently, even though our relationship was a little bent. And she would look over at me and she would say, "Do you not notice anything any differently?" And I would say, "Oh, well, did you get a haircut or did you buy new plants for the house?" I said, I'm not really certain what you're wanting me to see." Well, it was a cup of coffee that she had in her hand. And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, is it just you wanted that to calm you?" And not really being able to put the pieces together, but she looked at me and she said, "I laid the alcohol down and I quit drinking and smoking." To which I said, "You did?" And in that moment, I knew that God had heard every prayer that I had prayed as a 9-year-old little girl. It didn't come to tuition until this moment when God knew it would be pivotal. I learned a lot about overcoming in that moment. I watched someone who had struggled with alcohol abuse literally lay down an addictive habit she had had for years. I would watch for months after my mom would develop stomach issues that ultimately she had, but the alcohol kind of masked the feelings. My mom would get hospitalized, and the fear of losing her was real. There were moments that the doctors would tell us because they didn't know what it was in that moment to prepare for her not to come home. And I remember praying and saying, "God, I know you didn't just deliver my mama from all of these addictions for her to leave me in the middle of a pregnancy." I spent that full week in that hospital room praying over her body. She left the hospital a week later, and to this day, 13 years later, my mama is still alcohol and tobacco free, and she's in church. We're going to church together. And if anyone has heard anything out of Christy and I's podcast so far, I hope you understand what overcoming looks like. Because my mama and her mama overcame so much.
What an amazing and redemptive story. And what a great example of a daughter setting healthy boundaries with her mother, and God using your prayers as a spiritual tool in recovery and restoration for your mother. It's truly incredible.
Yeah.
I can relate to your story about spending time in the hospital with your mother and worrying over her the way you did and praying over her. I too spent so many days and nights in the hospital with my mother. She had smoked since she was 12 or 13, and at 43 years old, she was diagnosed with COPD. She was on oxygen for the last 5 years of her life. She had chronic bronchitis, asthma, she had nerve damage throughout her body, degenerative disc disease. She had diverticulitis. I could go on. There were several other health conditions. And in those last few years, me and my sisters shared in the responsibility of doing things like cleaning her house. I did her grocery shopping. I wrote her bills for her. And it was really, really difficult watching her decline. It was also difficult learning to set boundaries in my late 20s with my dying mother.
Yeah.
I carried a lot of guilt and confusion around trying to stand up for myself with her. I spent so much time seeking a delicate balance between respecting my mother and standing up for myself.
Yeah.
The last time my mother was admitted into the hospital, we painfully watched her decline over a period of 72 hours. We moved her to a nursing home, and a week before her 48th birthday, and on her last night spent there, along with her little dog in the bed beside her, I had the opportunity to be holding her. I held her close to me as she took her last breath. And I immediately felt a rush of peace move through my body.
Wow.
My mother was a Christian, and at that night, and during that night, I knew that she was finally free. She was free from all of her childhood trauma, her sickness, mind, body, and spirit. She was no longer suffering. And I have details from her early life. So I have a reason to feel compassion and empathy for her, no matter whatever happened between us.
Absolutely.
Any hurt she ever caused me, I know was a direct reflection of her fear and her need for control. And it was related to her perceived need to protect me. She never went to counseling. She never learned how to channel these fears. But the only way I was ever able to overcome the pressure of our relationship was to keep loving her where she was. I had to learn boundaries. I had to learn strategies and tools to use with her. If I was going to continue this relationship, if I was going to continue to have my mother in my life, I had to get the help that I needed to know how to do that. And I had to understand that she really was doing the best she could do with what she had.
Yeah.
Not by accepting her unacceptable behavior, but by learning how to set boundaries. And I did finally learn to say things like, "What you've just said to me hurt, and I'm hanging up the phone now because I don't have to continue this conversation." Those those times, those things were never easy, but I did make peace with knowing that I couldn't change her. I couldn't control her behavior like she had tried to control me for so long.
Wow.
And I will say that I felt so much closer to her when she was sick, and I was there taking care of her when she was helpless. I don't know how that sounds, but I felt close to her. And I felt closer to her after her death because I finally felt like I could have the relationship I had always wanted to have with her, one that she wasn't trying to control.
Yeah.
And God gave me a peace that I didn't understand in the beginning of my grief stages after her death. It took me a long time to cry, and I sometimes felt guilty because I couldn't cry. But God helped me focus on the positive memories that we had, like camping and riding horses, and the way that she made a big deal out of our birthdays, and the way that she took notes in her Bible. I chose to focus on the fact that regardless of her imperfections, she was a child of God.
Yeah.
She wasn't perfect, but she was loved by a perfect God.
Yeah.
And I love her because God chose her to be my mother. She often told me that I saved her life and that her children were all gifts from God. She chose life for me. She very
Yeah.
easily, at 16, could have chosen something else. She could have chosen abortion. She could have
Yeah.
chosen adoption. She chose life for me. She chose to keep me. She was told after her accident that she wouldn't have children. So she believed in miracles.
Mm.
If I could name a scripture that honors and represents her life, it would be this. 1 Peter 5:10. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you.
Yes.
I believe that God did this for her, and knowing this is how I was able to overcome any and all struggle we ever experienced in our relationship. And if you ever wonder why I collect bees and I love little bees, now you know.
Man, truly powerful. I really feel after reading that, like I know so much about um, your mother, and I really feel like knowing how God works, that your mama really did need you.
Yeah.
Your mama needed someone that was going to love her despite her challenges and to show her that grace and mercy. And it may have never been reciprocated, but I'm almost certain that your mama knew that you loved her, even despite those challenges, because that does take a lot for a person to set aside their own needs to want to be protected and kept safe to make sure that their mama knows they still love them.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate just hearing, we're best friends. We have been friends for a really long time. And just in ordinary conversations, these types of things don't always typically come up. So to be able to have them has really just been just so freeing for my soul, and just I feel like I've learned a little bit extra about you today. It's been awesome. I mean, the whole bee thing still has me because it just makes sense now. Why you like? I know you loved bees before, but now even the correlation behind it's even better. When I tell you though that I could sit down and fill in this story with many, many more details, as I know Christy could, and what I had to witness my mom and myself overcome, I truly mean it. I just pray that what we have shared will inspire you to walk in salvation with Jesus and become an overcomer.
Yeah.
Healing in me from the loss of a father, meaning he was just not present, to a mother who shamefully abused alcohol while battling demons of self worth and wondering if she was good enough, to having a child and hearing the news of not being able to ever carry again, to almost losing my mother to an undiagnosed stomach ailment, which we do know what it is now, has taught me so much about overcoming. And in my current marriage, I'm learning about overcoming. It has taught me that with God, all things are possible. And if you remember, I shared a minute ago that 7, 8, and 9-year-old me prayed for the day that my mom would lay her alcohol down. But it wasn't until 22-year-old me delivered her first child that my mom was free of alcohol. And it had nothing to do with me or my son. It had everything to do with God's divine moment and time that He wanted my mother free of those demons and free to live out the rest of her life. It has made me realize that overcoming may not be one giant issue. It could be a million little lies or beliefs that you have to break out of and overcome. And we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the words of our testimony. Being a Christian does not entail staying silent about the entangled, messy pieces of our life. The Bible says we are overcomers by the words of our testimony.
Mm.
And that means sharing the good and the bad of how you overcome everything that was meant to destroy you for someone else to see how God has made a way. If He can make a way for you, He can do it for someone else. And I feel like as Christians, sometimes we battle with this need to look perfect and well groomed and well put together. But if there's anything that Christy and I want to portray on our podcasting and on our platforms, is that we are set apart, but we are not perfect. And it is important to share our struggles so others can see how God will work through us. That does bring us to the end of our episode 3, part 1, on the topic of overcoming. Thank you for joining us for our discussion on overcoming mother-daughter relationship struggles. We hoped you gained encouragement and a word from Jesus today. If you enjoyed our show, please rate and review us on YouTube Podcast. Join us again on March 2nd for episode 3, part 2 of our Overcoming series. You won't want to miss this candid chat on overcoming father-daughter relationship struggles. Thank you for listening to Small Circle Big Impact. Until then, this is Amanda and Christy.